The cop had her face first against the hood of his cruiser before she could say a single word, her fractured shoulder screaming, her scrubs smeared with blood that wasn't hers, and a parking lot full of witnesses who didn't move an inch. Officer Dale Voss had spent 6 years learning exactly how much he could get away with, and today he decided this quiet, unassuming nurse was his next example. What he didn't know, what nobody in that parking lot knew, was that the woman he was grinding into the hood of his patrol car had once held a defensive perimeter for 14 hours in a forward operating base while her squad bled out around her. She hadn't broken then. She wasn't going to break now. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're in the right place. Follow along until the very end, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most of Nora Callahan's mornings started, badly, and earlier than anyone should have to be awake. She was pulling into the staff lot at Kessler Regional Medical Center in the city of Driftwood Falls at 5:48 a.m., 12 minutes before her shift technically began, because 12 minutes was how long it took to change into her scrubs, check the whiteboard in the ER, and actually understand what she was walking into before it walked into her. The November air hit her when she opened the car door, sharp and wet, the kind of cold that reminded you winter wasn't coming. It was already here. She moved carefully, the way she'd been moving for 3 weeks. Right arm close to her body, left hand doing most of the work. A compensating habit she'd developed so automatically she barely noticed it anymore. The shoulder had happened on a Thursday. She was off duty, driving home on Route 9 after a double shift, when she saw the pileup. 3 vehicles, one of them on its side. She pulled over before she'd finished thinking about it. Spent 40 minutes on the asphalt stabilizing a teenager with a punctured lung before the ambulance arrived, working one-handed because somewhere in the chaos, she'd taken a hard impact from a door panel that she didn't realize had fractured her shoulder until 2 days later when the pain stopped being ignorable. She hadn't filed a workers' comp claim. It wasn't a work injury. She'd taken the reduced duty assignment from her charge nurse, Margaret Ewan, without complaint, and she'd kept showing up. That was the thing about Nora Callahan. She just kept showing up. She was 31 years old and had been a nurse at Kessler Regional for 2 years, which made her one of the newer faces in the ER, despite the fact that she moved through the department with the kind of quiet authority that usually took a decade to develop. She didn't explain herself much. She didn't talk about where she'd worked before Driftwood Falls, or why she'd moved here, or what she'd done in the years between finishing her nursing degree and walking through Kessler's doors. Her coworkers had theories. The most popular one was that she'd done some kind of traveling nurse work in rough places. Nobody asked directly because something in her manner made direct questions feel impolite. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than their theories. She made it through the ambulance bay doors, nodded to the overnight tech, and had almost reached the locker room when Margaret caught her in the hallway. "How's the shoulder?" "Fine." Margaret gave her a look that meant she didn't believe that, but had decided not to push it today. "You've got a visitor, waiting room. Says he's from the city traffic office." Nora stopped. "What does he want?" "Didn't say. But he's been here since before my shift started, which means he came at shift change on purpose." Margaret lowered her voice. "He's a cop, Nora. Plain clothes, but cop. You can just tell when." Nora set her bag down on the nurse's station counter. "What's his name?" "Voss. Dale Voss." She didn't recognize the name. She went to the waiting room. He was leaning against the wall near the vending machines with his arms crossed, and the specific kind of patience that isn't patience at all. It's performance. Late 40s, thick through the neck, wearing a jacket that was too clean for plain clothes work. The kind of man who'd spent long enough in a position of authority that he'd stopped distinguishing between asking people things and telling them things. "Nora Callahan?" He said her name like he already knew the answer. "That's me. Officer Dale Voss, Traffic Division." He showed her a badge quickly, the way people do when they know you won't have time to read the number. "You were involved in an incident on Route 9 on the 14th. 3-car accident. I stopped to help." He pulled out a small notebook. The notebook was a prop. She could tell because he didn't look at it. "We have a complaint from the driver of the vehicle that was struck. Says a bystander, your description, interfered with the scene. allegedly moved one of the injured parties before emergency crews arrived. Nora kept her face neutral. She'd had conversations like this before, in different contexts, and she knew that the way you responded in the first 30 seconds determined the shape of everything that followed. The teenager in Vehicle 2 had a tension pneumothorax developing, she said. If I'd waited for EMS, he would have been in full respiratory arrest before they got him out of the car. I stabilized him in place. I didn't move him. Voss wrote something down, or pretended to. You're a nurse? Yes. At this hospital? Yes. And you were off duty? Yes. So you weren't operating under any official capacity. Something cool moved through her, not fear, something older than fear and steadier. I'm a licensed healthcare professional who rendered emergency aid at the scene of an accident. That's protected under Good Samaritan statute. Well, Voss closed his notebook. That's one interpretation. He left without saying anything else. Nora stood in the waiting room and watched him go, and the thing she felt wasn't relief. It was the particular specific unease of recognizing a move in the middle of a game she hadn't agreed to play. She went to change her scrubs. She went to work. The shift was the kind of busy that Kessler's ER ran on. A broken wrist from a school playground, 2 flu presentations and elderly patients, a construction worker with a nail gun injury to his palm that required 3 hours and a hand surgeon. Nora worked reduced duty, which meant assessments and documentation and support roles rather than procedures, a limitation she managed to make almost invisible by being faster at the parts she could still do than most nurses were at all of them. Around noon, her colleague Dante Reyes set a cup of coffee next to her at the workstation. Dante had been in the ER for 9 years and had the kind of calm that came from having seen everything at least twice. You okay? He said. You've had your thinking face on all morning. I always have my thinking face on. No, you have your working face most of the time. This is different. He leaned against the counter. The cop who was here this morning, do you know him? No? I do, by reputation. He kept his voice low, professional. He's got a pattern, Nora. Tends to come after people connected to accident scenes when there's someone involved who doesn't want scrutiny. There was a family last year. Dante, I'm just telling you. I know you are. She looked at him. Who's the driver of the car that was struck? In the Route 9 accident? He paused. I don't know. Can you find out? He looked at her for a long moment. I'll ask around. She finished her coffee. She went back to work. The second half of the shift was quieter, and quiet in an ER is always slightly menacing because you know what comes next. At 4:15 p.m., with 45 minutes left on her shift, Margaret found her in Bay 3 doing a medication reconciliation. Nora, there's a situation at the ambulance entrance. She followed Margaret out through the sliding doors into the patient drop-off lane, and that's where she first saw Officer Voss again, except this time he wasn't alone. There was a patrol car parked diagonally across the ambulance lane, which was already a particular kind of statement, and Voss was standing next to it with a uniformed officer she didn't recognize, and between them was a clipboard and what appeared to be a printed document. Ms. Callahan. Voss had dropped the polite half of his tone from this morning. Just her last name now, no question mark at the end. I need you to come with me. I'm on shift. Your shift ends at 5. It's 4:15, 45 minutes. He said it like he'd known her schedule before he arrived. I'd like to do this quietly. Do what quietly? He held up the document. I have a citation here for interfering with an accident scene and interfering with an emergency response. I also have reason to believe you had an altercation with a city employee during the Route 9 incident. That's not what happened. And I'm asking you to come with me voluntarily. If you don't want to do this voluntarily. He let that hang. Margaret stepped forward. She's a nurse in the middle of her shift. You can't just... Ma'am, I'm not talking to you. Voss didn't even look at her. Ms. Callahan, last chance to do this without the cuffs. Nora stood still for 3 full seconds. The parking lot was not empty. There were patients being dropped off, a family walking toward the entrance, 2 paramedics from a different unit watching from 20 feet away. She calculated all of this. She thought about what happened when you gave someone like Voss a public scene to control. Fine, she said. I'll come with you. She should have known that wasn't what he actually wanted. He moved fast, faster than she expected, and he had her arm, the wrong arm, the injured arm, and she couldn't entirely suppress the sharp sound she made as the pain blew through her shoulder, and then he had her against the hood of the patrol car, her cheek against the cold metal, his hand between her shoulder blades. What? She started. Hands behind your back. You said no cuffs. I said last chance. You hesitated. The cuffs clicked into place, and she heard herself say, my shoulder, in a voice that was quieter and more stripped down than she'd intended. And Voss said something to his partner that she didn't catch. The metal of the car hood was cold against her face. She turned her head, and she could see the paramedics frozen at their vehicle, and the family near the entrance had stopped walking, and the automatic doors kept opening and closing on nothing because no one was moving through them. Margaret's voice sharp. She has a fracture. Her shoulder is fractured. Get your hands. Ma'am, step back or I will cite you for obstruction. Nora closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. An old habit from a different time, a different kind of danger. Find the still point, let the noise run past it, figure out what you can actually control. What she could control right now was her breathing. Nothing else. So she breathed. Inside the hospital, news moved the way it always moved, faster than any official communication, carried by staff who'd seen something and couldn't not tell the next person they passed. Within 10 minutes, the ER charge desk knew. Within 15, the hospital administrator's office knew. Within 20, half of Kessler Regional knew that one of their ER nurses was in handcuffs in the ambulance bay, and the story was already fracturing into versions of itself the way stories do. What didn't fracture was what happened next. Dante Reyes came out through the ambulance bay doors and stopped when he saw Nora. He was still holding a patient chart. His face did something complicated and then settled into a stillness she recognized as controlled anger. What is the charge? He said. He wasn't addressing Nora. He was addressing Voss, and he was using the specific tone of a man who had decided he was going to get an official answer. Sir, you need to go back inside. She's my colleague, and she has a documented shoulder fracture, and I want to know what the legal basis is for this arrest, because I'm calling the hospital's legal department in about 30 seconds. Dante. Nora's voice was level. Don't. He looked at her. Nora, go back inside, please. She held his gaze and put something in the look that she hoped he would read correctly. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Don't make it worse faster. He stood there another moment. Then he went inside. Voss escorted her to the back of the patrol car. The door closed. Through the window she could see the ambulance bay, and the parking lot beyond it, and the road beyond that, and a November sky going gray at the edges with the particular gray of a storm deciding whether it's coming or not. She was cold. Her shoulder was doing something it hadn't done in 3 weeks, a deep grinding sensation that the physical therapist had told her meant she was pushing against where the healing was. She sat in the back of the patrol car, and she did not show what she was feeling. She had learned that a long time ago, in circumstances that made this one look straightforward. Voss got in the front. His partner drove. They didn't take her to the precinct, which was the first thing she noticed. They took her to the hospital administrator's office suite, which was the second thing she noticed. And the third thing she noticed was that the administrator, a man named Gerald Fitch, whom she'd met twice and never liked, was already there and already looked like he'd expected this. Miss Callahan? Fitch stood up behind his desk. He was the kind of administrator who wore his authority on the outside like a coat. I understand Officer Voss has some concerns about an incident that may involve hospital staff conduct. This isn't about hospital conduct, she said. This is about me stopping to help at a car accident on my own time. There's been a complaint filed. Fitch glanced at Voss. Given the nature of the complaint and pending the investigation, we're going to need to temporarily suspend your privileges here at Kessler. The word landed in the room and she felt it land. You're suspending me. Temporarily. Based on a complaint from a traffic officer about something that happened off-site, off-duty, 3 weeks ago. Fitch folded his hands on his desk. We take all matters involving our staff very seriously. She looked at him. She looked at Voss. She understood in that moment that these two men had spoken to each other before she'd arrived, possibly more than once. "I'd like to see the complaint," she said. "That's being processed through. I'd like to see it now." Fitch's face did a small thing, a micro-expression of annoyance quickly covered. "That's not how our... You're suspending my hospital privileges based on a document I haven't seen. I'm asking to see it. That's a reasonable request." Silence. Voss spoke from behind her. "The complaint will be made available through the formal process." She turned to look at him over her injured shoulder, which cost her something. "What's the name of the person who filed the complaint?" Neither man answered. She turned back to Fitch. "I need to call someone." "Of course." Fitch gestured at the phone on his desk with elaborate courtesy. "You're welcome to..." "My own phone." She looked at Voss. "I'm detained but not under arrest. I have the right to make a call." Voss unclipped the handcuffs. He did it without expression, dropped them in his jacket pocket like they were a set of keys. She pulled out her phone and she made a call. Not to a lawyer, not to Dante. She called a number she hadn't called in 8 months, and when it rang twice and then picked up, she said 3 words. "I need you." What Nora Callahan had not told her coworkers at Kessler Regional, and what she had not told Gerald Fitch, and what she had very specifically not told Officer Dale Voss, was that she had spent 5 years as a United States Army combat nurse before her discharge. She had deployed twice. She had held the rank of captain. She had spent 14 months total in active conflict zones doing things that military nurses did in those places, which were things that civilian nurses did not do, and which left a particular kind of mark that didn't show on the outside. She'd come back and gotten out and come to Driftwood Falls because a friend of a friend had mentioned the area was quiet. She needed quiet. Not in the sense of peace, exactly, more in the sense of a space where she could figure out who she was when no one was shooting at her. She'd been working on that project for 2 years and felt like she was making progress, which was probably why she'd stopped mentioning the military at all. It felt like something she was putting behind her. She was about to find out that some things don't stay behind you. The number she'd called belonged to Marcus Trent. He was the commander of a veterans motorcycle convoy called the Iron Watch Brotherhood, 47 members strong, who were currently, as of the last text he'd sent her 3 days ago, traveling north through the state on their annual memorial run. She'd served with Marcus in the second deployment. He was the reason she'd gotten out with as few pieces missing as she had, and he was the reason she'd landed in Driftwood Falls, because it was his aunt's apartment she'd rented for the first 6 months. She'd said 3 words. He'd said 2. "Where are you?" She told him. He said 20 minutes. She put her phone in her pocket and sat down in the chair across from Fitch's desk and waited. 22 minutes later, she heard them. You heard a convoy before you saw one. The sound came up from the street, a low, layered rumble that started as something you felt more than heard and built into something that rattled the single-pane window behind Fitch's desk. Fitch stood up. Voss moved to the window and looked out, and his expression did something she couldn't quite read from across the room. 47 motorcycles don't fit in a hospital parking lot. They make do. She stood up. She moved to stand beside Voss at the window, and she looked down at the parking lot, and she counted. Not because she needed to, but because it was an old habit. 12, 15, 20, more. They were filling every available space, and the ones who couldn't park were stopped in the access road, and every single engine cut off at almost exactly the same moment, which produced a silence more emphatic than the noise had been. Marcus Trent climbed off his bike. He was a large man, 52 years old, with a gray-streaked beard, and the particular posture of someone who had spent a long time being responsible for other people's lives. He was wearing his convoy vest with the unit patches. 46 other people were getting off their motorcycles behind him. "Who the hell called them?" Voss said. Nora said nothing. Fitch was on his phone. "Security, I need someone at the main entrance. Yes, now." Marcus looked up at the building. He didn't know which window she was at. She was pretty sure he couldn't see her, but he looked up in the way that people look up when they know someone is watching, a kind of acknowledgement sent at the sky. Then he walked toward the hospital entrance. Fitch was still on the phone. Voss had his hand on his radio. Nora picked up her bag, which was sitting on the floor next to the chair where she'd been told to sit, and she slung it over her good shoulder. "Where do you think you're going?" Voss said. To meet my people, she said. She walked out of the administrator's office and down the hallway and into the elevator. She pressed L for lobby. The elevator hummed downward. When the doors opened, she could see through the lobby windows that Marcus Trent was at the entrance, and hospital security was at the entrance, and there was an argument happening that she could hear through the glass without being able to make out words. She pushed through the lobby door. Marcus saw her immediately. Whatever he'd been saying to the security guard stopped. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he'd always looked, like he was taking inventory, and then he looked at her shoulder, the way she was holding it, and his face did something brief and complicated. Nora, he said. Marcus, she said. You look like hell. You look the same. He almost smiled. This hospital's suspending you. Temporarily. Based on what? Still working on finding that out. He nodded. He turned to the security guard, a young man who looked like he would have preferred to be anywhere else on Earth right now. We're going to need the parking lot for a bit. Any issue with that? The security guard looked at Nora. He looked at the parking lot full of motorcycles. He looked at Marcus. I'll need to check with... Sure, Marcus said. We'll be outside. He held the door. She walked through it. Outside, the cold hit her again, and she stopped at the top of the concrete steps and looked out at the 47 people arranged across the parking lot, some standing by their bikes, some talking in low voices, all of them looking at her. People she recognized. People she'd served with, or who'd served with people she'd served with, or who wore the patches of units she knew. A woman named Petra Hanks, who'd been a medic with the 75th, raised her chin at Nora. A silent acknowledgement, economical, the kind of communication that didn't need words. Nora looked out at all of them and felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years, something she hadn't realized she'd been missing until this exact moment. Not warmth exactly. Something more structural, like a load-bearing wall you forgot was there until you needed it. Behind her, the hospital doors opened. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. Boss's voice. Ms. Callahan, I need you to... Officer. Marcus's voice was quiet in particular. Not loud, just present. I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what you've charged her with. Voss stopped. She heard him stop. Who are you? Marcus Trent, Commander, Iron Watch Brotherhood Veterans Convoy. Nora Callahan served under my command. I need you to tell me what she's been charged with. A pause. That's a matter between me and... It's a matter I'm asking you about directly, right now, in front of witnesses. Marcus's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It was just flat and clear and apparently had no intention of moving. What is she charged with? The question sat in the November cold and no one answered it, and the silence itself was a kind of answer. Then, from somewhere down the access road, they heard it. Not motorcycles this time. Something heavier. A low grinding sound followed by impact. One impact, then a second, and then the unmistakable percussion of something large losing structural integrity, followed by a sound that was less an explosion than a concussion, the forced rapid movement of a large quantity of air. And then the alarm, multiple alarms, car alarms, and something more institutional, and under all of it a human sound, indistinct with distance, that raised the hair on the back of her neck. Everyone in the parking lot turned toward the road. Marcus turned. Nora turned. Half a mile down Route 9, a column of black smoke was already rising into the gray afternoon sky. She was moving before she'd finished processing what she was seeing. Her bag was over her good shoulder. She was going down the steps. Behind her, she heard Marcus say something short to someone, and she heard boots on concrete, and she didn't look back because she already knew they were coming. Officer Dale Voss stood at the top of the hospital steps and watched a suspended nurse and 47 military veterans start running toward a disaster. And for the first time since he'd pulled into the ambulance bay that morning, he had absolutely nothing to say. The smoke was the black kind, which meant fuel, and fuel meant fire, and fire at a crash scene meant the math got worse every second she wasn't there. Nora hit the sidewalk at a run, cutting across the corner of the parking lot and through the gap in the low concrete barrier that separated the hospital property from Route 9. Her shoulder was doing something specific and unpleasant, but she filed that under information rather than emergency and kept moving. Behind her, she could hear the convoy falling in. Not a mob, not a crowd, but something organized, moving with the kind of purposeful efficiency that only came from people who'd done this before under worse conditions. Route 9 was a 4-lane road that connected the eastern edge of Driftwood Falls to the industrial stretch closer to the highway interchange. At 4:40 in the afternoon, it should have had moderate traffic. What it had instead was stop traffic, because half a mile down, in the intersection where 9 crossed Harmer Bridge Road, something very large had gone very wrong. She got close enough to see it clearly. A military transport truck, one of the medium-weight cargo variants, 6 wheels, canvas over the bed, had come through the intersection and been struck on the driver's side by a fuel tanker that had failed to stop. The impact had driven the transport sideways, jackknifed it partially, and the tanker was now at a 40-degree angle with its rear end up against the concrete median barrier and fuel bleeding from a split in the tank housing. The fire wasn't in the cab yet. It was underneath, where the spilled fuel had found something hot enough to care. She was doing the count before she reached the perimeter. Transport truck. Military markings, which meant personnel. Canvas back, which meant she couldn't see how many. Tanker driver's side door was crumpled, which meant the driver had not gotten out on his own. 3 civilian vehicles were stopped, 2 of them with visible contact damage, and a 4th had rear-ended the second during the chain stop. Marcus? She didn't raise her voice. He was right behind her. I see it. Transport first. I need to know how many in the back. Petra, he said, and Petra Hanks was already moving left, flanking toward the back of the transport at a low jog. 2 others went with her. Nora went straight to the transport cab. The driver was a young soldier, early 20s, conscious but disoriented, with a cut above his left ear that was bleeding in the committed way that head wounds bled, messy and alarming in volume even when the underlying damage was minor. She got the door open on the second pull and got her hand to his neck, and his pulse was fast but present and strong. Hey, she put herself in his eyeline. Look at me. What's your name? He blinked. Kowalski. Kowalski, I'm a nurse. Are you hurting anywhere besides your head? He moved his shoulders experimentally, winced. No, is the truck on fire? Working on that. Can you move your legs? He could. She got him out of the cab herself, which cost her shoulder something significant she didn't have time to account for, and she walked him 10 steps back from the vehicle and put him on the ground, because sitting people down after head trauma was better than letting them stand and make the decision for you. Petra's voice from the back of the transport, controlled but carrying. Nora, we've got 8. One's not moving. She moved. The canvas back of the transport had partially shredded in the impact, and Petra had already pulled one flap clear. 8 soldiers, varying states of awareness. Most of them had been seated and braced for the impact, which was the only reason the numbers weren't worse. 7 were upright or moving. The 8th was a woman in her 30s, slumped against the side rail of the truck bed, not responsive. Nora climbed into the truck bed. Her shoulder screamed at the climbing motion, and she noted it and continued. She got her hands on the unconscious soldier and ran through the rapid assessment. Airway was clear, breathing present but shallow, pulse present, no obvious external hemorrhage, but the positioning of her head and the way she'd slumped suggested she'd taken an impact to the skull against the truck's side rail. She needs to be immobilized, she said. Who's got a first aid kit? 3 of the conscious soldiers moved at once, producing 2 trauma kits from storage cases under the bench seats. She understood instantly that these were not raw recruits. They'd seen things. They knew what to do when someone said trauma kit in that tone. Hold her head. Exactly like this. She positioned the nearest soldier's hands where she needed them. He held. He didn't ask questions. She stripped open the kit and worked. From outside the truck, she could hear the growing sound of civilian chaos, bystanders, the crackle of the fire under the tanker, someone on a phone, car alarms still going, and over all of it, gradually, the faint layered wail of sirens that meant EMS had been called and was coming and was not yet here. She had been in situations where she was the only trained medical person present, and EMS was not coming for 14 minutes, and there were 11 casualties spread across a 100-meter radius. This was not that. This was manageable. She ran the triage math in her head and moved to the next soldier. Well, Outside the transport, Marcus and 7 of his convoy were handling the tanker driver. The man's name, they'd find out later, was Roy Packer. 56 years old, 30 years in commercial trucking, and he was trapped. The driver's side door had buckled inward and his left leg was pinned between the door panel and the center column. He was conscious and vocal and deeply unhappy about the fire under his truck. "Get me out," he kept saying. "Please get me out." "We're working on it," Marcus told him. He was not a medic. He was, however, a man who had spent 2 decades solving problems under pressure, and the problem in front of him was a man, a door, and insufficient leverage. He looked at his people. Terrence, Jimmy, other side. "When I say push, you push toward me. Steady, not hard." Terrence and Jimmy, both former infantry, went around the cab. Marcus got his shoulder against the door panel, the outside, below the window, and got his feet placed on the concrete. Push. The door didn't move the first time. The second time it moved 3 inches. The third time it moved enough. Packer got his leg free. It was ugly. The man bit down on a scream and Marcus caught him coming out of the cab, but the leg was free. They walked him back from the tanker as fast as he could manage, which was not fast. And when they were 50 feet clear, the fuel under the tanker found something new and the fire jumped. Not an explosion. A surge. A rapid expansion of flame that rolled from under the tanker and found the split in the fuel housing and turned it into a 4-foot spout of burning fuel. The bystanders on the sidewalk went back fast. Marcus and his people were already clear. Nora was still in the transport bed with her patient when the fire surged, and she felt the heat change through the canvas walls, the air temperature inside the truck going up 3 degrees in 2 seconds, and she looked up and made the call. "Everybody out, now." She came out last, walking backward down the truck bed with both hands steadying the unconscious soldier who 4 other people were carrying between them. And they cleared the transport and kept moving, kept the distance building, until the fire department's lead engine came around the corner of Harmer Bridge Road with its air horn going and the calculation shifted. She stopped when she had 50 feet between her patients and the nearest vehicle. She took 1 full breath. Then she started running the triage again from the beginning because that was the job. The first EMS unit arrived 4 minutes later. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman, both of them stopping at the edge of the scene and trying to process what they were looking at. 8 military personnel in varying states of injury. 1 civilian with a pinned leg now sitting against the median barrier. A nurse in hospital scrubs with a fractured shoulder, directing triage like she was reading from a script she'd written herself. And 40-something civilians on motorcycles who had apparently organized the entire scene, established a perimeter, flagged down 3 different cars that had tried to enter the disaster zone from the north end, and improvised a windbreak around the most critical patient using their own jackets. The female paramedic, her name tag said Torres, jogged to Nora. "Your medical?" "ER nurse, Kessler Regional. Your critical is the female soldier, TBI suspected. She's been unresponsive for..." Nora checked. 7 minutes now. She needs imaging. Her airway is clear and she's breathing, but her pupils aren't responding the way I'd like. Torres was already keying her radio. "What's your name?" "Callahan, Nora Callahan." "Callahan." Torres wrote it on her forearm with a marker, the way paramedics did when they needed information to survive the handoff. "Who set up the perimeter?" "They did." Nora gestured at the convoy. "They're veterans. They know what they're doing." Torres looked at the convoy. She looked at the organized perimeter, the flagged vehicles, the patients grouped by acuity. She said, under her breath, something that might have been okay then, and got back on her radio. 2 more EMS units arrived in the next 90 seconds. A fire engine was already on the tanker. The scene was transitioning from chaos to system, which was the goal, and Nora felt something in her chest loosen by approximately 1 degree. That was when she heard Marcus say, "Nora." Something in his voice, not alarm exactly, something flatter and more specific. She turned. There were 2 vehicles she hadn't noticed arriving during the transition. A dark blue SUV and a gray sedan, both with government plates, parked on the north shoulder. 3 people had gotten out of them. 2 were in civilian clothes but wearing lanyards. The third was in uniform, not local police. Federal. They were standing at the edge of the scene looking at it. One of them was on a phone, another had a tablet out. The one in uniform was looking directly at her. She felt the shape of something she couldn't name yet. Some pattern, not fully visible, like a word on the tip of your tongue. "Who are those people?" she said. Marcus said, "I don't know, but the one with the tablet just photographed the transport truck." She looked at the transport truck. She looked at the military markings. She thought about something that had been sitting at the edge of her awareness since she first ran onto the scene. Transport trucks carrying military personnel did not travel Route 9 through downtown Driftwood Falls. Route 9 was not a military corridor. There was no base within 40 miles. The transport was going somewhere it shouldn't have been, or coming from somewhere it shouldn't have been, and either answer was a question she hadn't had time to ask. One of the soldiers, the corporal who'd steadied the unconscious woman's head while Nora worked, was sitting on the curb now, forearms on his knees, looking at the ground. She crossed to him. "Hey." She crouched. "Kowalski's going to be fine. Possible concussion? They'll scan him." He nodded, but he wasn't listening to that part. "What's your unit?" she said. He looked up at her, something working behind his eyes. "We're out of Hargrove Base." "Hargrove's north of here." "Yeah." "Where were you going?" He looked toward the federal vehicles. Back at her. He had the face of someone choosing between two things and not liking either option. "I don't know," he said. "The routing came down this morning. Last-minute change. We were supposed to go straight through to the National Guard depot on 15. Somebody changed the route. Changed it to go through the city? Changed it to go through this intersection, specifically." Nora went very still. "Corporal," she said. "Who changed the routing?" He shook his head once, not as a refusal, as a statement that he genuinely didn't know. "Came from the logistics office. I just drive where the orders say." She stood up slowly. She looked at the intersection. She looked at the fuel tanker, now mostly suppressed, with the fire crew working the residual burn. She looked at the path the tanker would have had to take to come through that intersection at that speed. She looked at the sight lines, the traffic light, the concrete median that forced the tanker into a specific lane before the intersection. The thought arrived fully formed, cold and geometric. This was a bad intersection for a fuel tanker to go through if you were the tanker driver. There were two better routes within 3 blocks. No commercial driver with 30 years of experience chose this route by accident. She turned and walked toward the federal vehicles. Marcus fell in beside her without being asked. She didn't tell him to stay back. If she was right about what she was walking toward, she wanted a witness. The man with the tablet saw her coming. He said something to the uniformed federal officer. They both looked at her. She stopped 6 feet away. "Nora Callahan," she said. "ER nurse, Kessler Regional. I ran triage on the military personnel." She looked at the man with the tablet. "I need to know if this intersection was an authorized route for that transport." The man with the tablet looked at the federal officer. The federal officer looked at Nora for a long moment. He was in his 40s, careful-faced, the kind of man who gathered information before he offered any. "What makes you ask that?" "The corporal in that unit says the routing was changed this morning, last minute. I want to know who changed it and why, because a fuel tanker took a route that no experienced commercial driver would take voluntarily and arrived at this intersection at exactly the moment a military transport would have been crossing it." She kept her voice level, factual. "That's either a remarkable coincidence or it isn't." The federal officer was very still. "What's your name?" she said. "Special Agent Dwight Calloway," he said. "Federal Transportation Safety Division." He paused. "We got a call about this accident 40 minutes ago, before it happened." The words arranged themselves in the cold air between them. Before it happened. "Someone called in the accident," Nora said, "before the accident occurred. An anonymous tip, routed through our emergency line, described a collision at this intersection, this time window." Calloway looked at the wreckage behind her. "We were 12 minutes out when we got the call. We were 7 minutes out when the collision occurred." Marcus beside her said nothing. She could feel him processing it the same way she was, the same methodical way you processed information that changed the shape of everything you thought you understood about a situation. Nora looked back toward the hospital, half a mile away. Route 9 connecting them directly. She looked at the federal vehicles. She looked at the corporal on the curb. She looked at the tanker. Then she looked at something she'd missed in the chaos of the scene. A patrol car, parked on the south end of the accident perimeter, tucked at the corner of Harmer Bridge Road with a sight line to the intersection. She hadn't noticed it during triage because it looked like every other patrol car that showed up at accident scenes. But it had been there when she arrived. She was almost certain of it. Before EMS. Before the other responding officers. It had been there at the beginning. She couldn't see who was in it from here. The windows were up. "Agent Calloway," she said, "that patrol car on the south end, is that one of yours?" He looked. His face shifted. Not much, but enough. "No," he said, "it's not." She was already moving, and behind her she heard Calloway say something sharp to the other agent, and she heard Marcus's boots on the road, and ahead of her the patrol car's engine turned over. It started pulling away. She broke into a run. The patrol car didn't go far. It couldn't. The north end of the accident perimeter was blocked by 2 EMS units and a fire engine, and the south end, the direction it was trying to leave from, had a second fire department vehicle that had arrived while Nora was talking to Calloway, cutting off the Harmer Bridge Road exit. The patrol car pulled forward 10 feet, stopped, pulled left, found no room, and stopped again. Nora was at the driver's side window before the engine cut off. She could see through the glass before the window came down. The officer inside was mid-40s, thick through the jaw, in full uniform, and he was doing the thing people did when they'd been caught at something and had decided the move was to behave as though they hadn't been, arranging his face into a version of professional boredom, reaching unhurriedly for his radio like this was something he'd parked for deliberately. The window came down. "Can I help you?" he said. "You were here before EMS," Nora said, "before any other responding unit." "I was in the area." "Your car was at the south end of this intersection when I arrived on scene. That's 3 minutes after impact, maybe 4. The first EMS unit logged arrival at 4:47. You were already here." She watched his face. Nothing moved. "What's your name?" "Officer Hartley. And ma'am, you need to step back from my vehicle." Hartley. Calloway had come up behind her, badge out, and his voice had changed timbre. It had become the specific flat tone of a federal agent who had stopped being conversational. "Special Agent Calloway, Federal Transportation Safety Division. I need you to step out of the vehicle." Hartley looked at the badge. Something happened in his eyes. A rapid internal calculation, the kind that took less than a second and produced a result that tightened his jaw. "I'm a responding officer at an accident scene," he said. "I don't need to—" "You're not a responding officer. You have no call log entry for this location. Your dispatch has you on Route 7 North as of 4:30. Calloway's tone didn't change. "Step out." A beat, 2 beats. Then Hartley opened the door. Nora stepped back. Marcus was behind her and to her left, and she was aware of 3 other convoy members fanned out in a loose semicircle that wasn't threatening exactly, but was the kind of geometry that made leaving without notice difficult. She hadn't asked them to do that. She didn't need to. Hartley got out of the car. He was taller than he'd looked sitting down. "I was monitoring the situation," he said. "Heard the call come in, was nearby." "Which channel?" Calloway said. "Excuse me?" "Which dispatch channel carried this call? Because we've already pulled the traffic division logs and this incident went out on Emergency Services Channel 2 at 1641. Your unit is Traffic Division, which monitors Channel 4. Calloway waited. "So tell me again how you heard the call." Hartley said nothing. It was the specific silence of a man who had prepared for this possibility and found that his preparation wasn't good enough, and who was now deciding whether the next move was to keep lying or to make a different calculation entirely. Nora wasn't watching his face anymore. She was watching his hands, an old habit. His right hand had moved twice toward his jacket pocket in the last 30 seconds without completing the motion. "Agent Calloway," she said, keeping her voice even. "His right jacket pocket." Calloway's eyes moved. His hand moved. "Hartley. Hands where I can see them. Now." What came out of Hartley's pocket, eventually, was a phone. Not his department-issued phone. A second one, personal, with a cracked screen and a recent call log that Calloway photographed without unlocking it, because he had the authority to secure it as evidence and the judgment to let the technical team do the rest. Hartley was placed in the back of the federal SUV, not in handcuffs yet, but with one of Calloway's agents sitting beside him, which communicated all the same information. Nora stood at the edge of the road and watched this, and felt the shape of the thing expanding in her mind. A route change, an early arriving officer, a tip called in before the accident. These were not the pieces of a coincidence. These were the pieces of a plan, imperfectly executed. And imperfect plans, in her experience, always had a center of gravity, someone who'd arranged the parts and expected a specific result. She thought about the Route 9 accident 3 weeks ago, the one where she'd stopped. She thought about the teenager with the tension pneumothorax. She thought about Dale Voss appearing at her hospital with a citation and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Marcus. She turned. The driver of the vehicle that struck the victims in the original accident, the one Voss said filed a complaint against me. I need a name. Dante was looking into it. Dante's at the hospital. She already had her phone out. She called him. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. Nora, where are you? It's all over the hospital. I'm at the crash site. Listen to me. The driver from the Route 9 accident. Did you find a name? A pause. She heard him exhale. Yeah, it took some asking around. The other driver, the one who caused the pileup, his name is Reed Callahan. No relation to you, 24 years old. His father is Stuart Callahan, who owns Callahan Civil Contractors. She absorbed that. What does Callahan Civil Contractors do? Infrastructure. Road contracts, mostly. They're doing the Route 9 expansion project, the one that's been on the city council docket for 2 years. Which city council member is the primary sponsor of that contract? I don't know that. Find out. She paused. Dante, is Voss still at the hospital? He was here 20 minutes ago. He went to the administrator's office. She ended the call. She looked at the federal vehicles, at Hartley in the back of the SUV, at the tanker still hissing steam where the fire crew had suppressed it. She looked at the military transport with its military markings and thought about why a military transport would have been rerouted through the center of Driftwood Falls on a last-minute order she was almost certain had not come from anyone at Hargrove Base. She walked to Calloway. The original accident, she said. Route 9, 3 weeks ago. Reed Callahan was driving the vehicle that caused it. His father owns Callahan Civil Contractors. She watched his face. I need to know if there's a connection between that company and any municipal contracts with routing authority over... Stop. Calloway held up one hand, not rudely, like a man hitting a wall in his own thinking. You're telling me you think the original accident was connected to this one. I'm telling you what I know and letting you make that determination. He looked at her for a moment. Really looked. The way people sometimes looked at her when she said something that recalibrated how they'd been categorizing her. What's your background, Ms. Callahan? Nurse. Before that? That's not relevant to what I just told you. He almost smiled, but didn't. Army? She didn't confirm it. She didn't have to. He turned back to the scene. If there's a connection between the original accident and this rerouting, it's evidence of coordinated obstruction, possibly more. He pulled out his own phone. I need to make calls. Make them, she said, but I need one thing first. He waited. Dale Voss, she said, Traffic Division. He came to my hospital today with falsified citations. He's been to the administrator's office. I need to know if his name comes up in any of what you're finding. Calloway's face was unreadable in the way of practiced people, but something in his posture changed, a fractional adjustment that told her the name wasn't new to him. Where's Voss now? He said. Last report, Kessler Regional. Calloway was already dialing. She got back to the hospital 20 minutes later, walking because the convoy bikes were still deployed in the lot and she wasn't going to ask Marcus to leave until she understood whether the scene was clear. Her shoulder had progressed from managed pain to something more insistent, the grinding sensation she'd described to her physical therapist, which meant the joint was inflamed and she was going to need ice and probably an X-ray and certainly something she didn't have time for right now. The ER entrance was busier than it should have been at 5:15. She understood why when she pushed through the ambulance bay doors. 3 of the 8 soldiers from the transport had been brought here, the most mobile of the non-critical cases. Torres's unit had routed the serious TBI to County General 2 miles north, which was the right call. County General had neurosurgical capacity that Kessler didn't. Dante was at the charge desk. When he saw her come through the doors, he moved immediately. "You're a shoulder," he said. "Later." "What did you find?" "City Council. The Route 9 expansion contract sponsor is a councilman named Gerald Park." He kept his voice down. They were at the edge of the nursing station, bodies turned so the conversation wasn't visible from the waiting room. Park's campaign was funded significantly by Callahan Seville. It's public record, but nobody's put it together because nobody was looking. "Who else?" "I made some calls. Went a little outside what I should probably have done." He had the look of a man who'd made a decision and wasn't fully comfortable with it, and wasn't going to pretend he was. "The complaint Voss filed against you? It was submitted through Park's office, not through traffic division, through the council office." She let that settle. "A city council member routed a police complaint." "The complaint was drafted on letterhead from Park's office. I got this from someone in records who owes me a favor. She's going to be uncomfortable when she realizes I'm going to use it." "I'll protect your source." "That's not the point." He looked at her squarely. "The point is these people went after you specifically because you stopped at that accident and treated Reed Callahan's victim before EMS arrived. If the kid had died at the scene or been worse off than he was, it would have been cleaner for them. No witnesses to the cause of the collision, no one who'd already assessed the victims and could testify to the timeline. You complicated their cleanup. So Voss was the cleanup. Voss was the cleanup." Dante pressed his lips together. "Nora, this isn't a parking ticket situation anymore." "I know. These people have reach. Fitch suspended you on 20 minutes' notice. That doesn't happen without pressure from somewhere above him." "I know," she said again. "Where's Voss?" Dante pointed. She turned. Voss was visible through the glass partition of the administrator's hallway, standing, not sitting, speaking to someone on his phone with his back to the window. Fitch was not visible, which meant Fitch was either in his office with the door closed or had made himself absent, which told her something about where Fitch thought this was going. She was 3 steps toward the hallway when the ambulance bay doors opened again. Torres came in, not with a patient, just Torres herself, moving fast, finding Nora with her eyes before she'd cleared the doorway threshold. "Callahan." She was slightly breathless, which Nora had not seen from her at the crash scene and registered accordingly. "The soldier, the TBI. They got her to County General and she's in imaging." She stopped in front of Nora. "She's going to be okay. They think." Nora let out a breath. "But that's not why I came back." Torres glanced toward the administrator's hallway. "We were talking to the soldiers, getting the transport information, and one of them, the corporal, the one you spoke to, he told us something. He said the rerouting order came through on a specific administrative code that's used for emergency logistics adjustments. The code is authorized by 3 people in Driftwood Falls city government." "One of them is Gerald Park," Nora said. Torres stared at her. "How did you—" "Who are the other 2? "We don't know yet. Calloway's team is pulling it." Torres's voice had dropped. "But there's something else. The transport wasn't just carrying personnel. There was equipment in the back, sealed cases, official transfer paperwork. The corporal doesn't know what was in them, but the transfer documents were signed by someone in the city logistics office." She looked steadily at Nora. "The name on the documents is Stuart Callahan." The name landed, and Nora went still in the specific way she went still when a situation rearranged itself into a shape she should have seen sooner. Stuart Callahan. Reed Callahan's father, owner of Callahan Civil Contractors, signing transfer documents on a military equipment transport, pulling the strings on a logistics rerouting through city government channels. The original accident, the one his son had caused, wasn't the beginning of this. It was the point where his plan had been disrupted, where someone had stopped to help and survived to talk, where Nora had stopped to help. "They weren't just covering up a car accident," she said. "No," Torres said. "They weren't." From the administrator's hallway, she heard Voss's voice rise briefly, then fall. His call had ended. He was moving toward the hallway door. She turned toward it. Nora, Marcus's voice from the ambulance bay entrance. She hadn't heard him come in. He was looking at the hallway. You should probably let Calloway handle this. Calloway's 2 miles away. He can be here in... Marcus? She faced him. Voss is going to walk out of that hallway and get in his car, and I will lose the thread. I've lost threads before. I know what it costs. She kept her voice even, but she could hear the edge under it, the place where the last 8 hours had worn through to something she didn't usually let surface. I'm not losing this one. He looked at her for a long moment, then, I'm coming with you. She didn't tell him not to. She pushed through the glass door into the administrator's hallway just as Voss came out of the alcove near Fitch's office. He saw her and stopped. The hallway was narrow, 12 feet wide, fluorescent lit, with the particular institutional smell of carpet cleaner and recycled air. There was no one else in it. Ms. Callahan, Voss said, you're suspended from this Reed Callahan, she said. Stuart Callahan. Callahan Civil Contractors. Gerald Park. Tell me which one of them you called first. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A rapid, involuntary shift, like a card player who'd been shown the hand he was hiding. I don't know what you're talking about. The transport that was hit today was rerouted through a city logistics code authorized by Park's office. The tip that an anonymous caller phoned in to Federal Transportation before the collision occurred, she watched his jaw, came from a cell phone with a Driftwood Falls area code, a personal phone, not a department phone. She kept moving toward him, 1 step, 2. Officer Hartley was at that intersection before EMS arrived. Someone told him to be there. That's a serious accusation. I know it is. She stopped 6 feet from him. I spent 3 weeks thinking this was about a citation, a piece of paper. Your way of making a problem go away. She held his gaze. It wasn't, was it? Voss looked at Marcus, who had come through the door behind her and was standing against the wall with his arms at his sides, in the specific posture of a man who had decided not to intervene and meant it. Voss looked back at Nora. You should talk to a lawyer, he said. The professional boredom was back in his voice, but it was working harder than it had been this morning. I agree, she said. You should do that too. Very soon. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed again. A different change this time. Not the card player caught. Something more like a man who'd gotten news he'd been expecting and didn't want. He answered it. He listened for 4 seconds. He said nothing. He ended the call. He looked at Nora, and she looked at him, and the hallway was very quiet. What was that? She said. He didn't answer, but he put his phone in his pocket with the specific, careful movement of someone deciding what to do with their hands, and then he looked past her at the ambulance bay doors, and she realized, a fraction before it happened, that he was going to try to walk out. She stepped into his path. That was Calloway, she said. It wasn't a question. He stopped. Get out of my way. You've been working for Stuart Callahan, not just this week, long enough that you knew how to route a complaint through a council office and who to call to get a city administrator to move within 20 minutes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Long enough that when a military transport showed up in their logistics paper trail, you knew someone would take the call. Get out of my way. You set up an accident, she said. People were hurt. A soldier is in a hospital right now with a brain bleed. She felt something moving through her, not rage. Nothing as hot as rage, something colder and more structural. That's not a citation. That's not obstruction. You know what that is. He moved to go around her. She didn't move. For 1 second, in the narrow fluorescent hallway, they looked at each other. Then the ambulance bay doors opened, and 2 people came through them who were not hospital staff and not paramedics. They were wearing the same lanyard she'd seen on Calloway's team. And behind them came Calloway himself, moving with the particular purposefulness of a man who had made his calls and gotten his answers and arrived exactly where he intended to be. Voss saw Calloway. His face went through several things in quick succession. Officer Voss, Calloway said, I need you to come with me. On what basis? Federal material witness warrant to start. Calloway's voice was quiet and entirely final. And we're going to need your phone, both of them. Voss turned. He looked at Nora once, a specific look, the kind that in another context might have been anger but had moved past anger into something she recognized as the expression of a man who had just felt the ground go out from under a plan he'd been standing on for a long time. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Calloway's agents moved past her and took Voss gently but definitively by the arms. Nora stepped back. Her shoulder was a sustained high note of pain. She was aware of being tired in a way that had reached past her muscles and into something more interior. She leaned against the hallway wall and watched them walk Voss toward the ambulance bay exit. Marcus came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything either. He didn't have the habit of filling silences with commentary, which was one of the things she'd always valued in him. Outside, through the ambulance bay windows, she could see the parking lot in the early evening dark, the convoy bikes still parked in their organized rows, a few of the members standing in clusters, visible in the lot lights. One of them, Petra Hanks, was leaning against her bike, looking at her phone. As though she felt the attention, she looked up, directly at the window, and raised her chin. Nora felt something shift in her chest. Then her own phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't have saved, local area code. She answered it. Callahan. The voice on the other end was male, older, and careful. My name is Warren Slade. I'm the Assistant Director of the Federal Transportation Safety Division, Western District. Agent Calloway briefed me 20 minutes ago. A pause. I need you to come to our field office tonight. We have footage we need you to look at. What kind of footage? Traffic camera footage, Slade said, from Route 9, from 3 weeks ago. Another pause, and in it she heard something that might have been discomfort, or might have been the particular weight of someone who'd just realized an injustice was larger than they'd initially understood. And from today, both intersections. We have a problem, Ms. Callahan, and I want you to see what we're looking at before we go any further with this. She pushed off the wall. Her shoulder registered the motion. She ignored it. Send me the address, she said. She ended the call. She turned to Marcus. I need a ride. He reached into his jacket pocket for his keys. Behind them, from down the hallway, a door opened. Gerald Fitch's office door. Fitch appeared in the frame. He looked at Nora. He looked at the empty space where Voss had been standing 60 seconds ago, at the absence of Calloway's agents, at the ambulance bay windows. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a pier, watching a boat leave without him. Nora looked at him for one full second. She said flatly and without inflection, You should call your legal department, Mr. Fitch. Then she walked out through the ambulance bay doors into the November cold, and Gerald Fitch stood in his empty hallway with the particular stillness of a man who had just realized that the people he'd been protecting were no longer in a position to protect him back. And somewhere in the city, in a federal field office on a screen that had been recording every second of the last 3 weeks, the truth that had been buried under paperwork and citations and a quiet nurse's suspended badge was still running, frame by frame, time-stamped and irrefutable, waiting for someone with the right authority to press play. The Federal Transportation Safety Division's field office in Driftwood Falls occupied the 3rd floor of a building on Meridian Street that from the outside looked like it housed an accounting firm and possibly a dentist. Inside, past the security desk and the elevator that took 40 seconds longer than it should have, it looked like what it was, a place where people sat in front of screens and built cases out of data. Warren Slade met them in the hallway outside the main operations room. He was 60, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the specific tiredness of a man who had been on the phone for the last 2 hours, receiving information he'd have preferred not to receive. He shook Nora's hand, looked at Marcus, and made a decision about him in approximately 3 seconds. He can come in, Slade said, which settled the question Marcus hadn't asked out loud. The operations room had 6 workstations and 3 large screens on the far wall. 2 of Calloway's agents were already there, along with a woman in civilian clothes who was introduced only as technical analysis, which told Nora everything about her function and nothing about her name, which was probably intentional. The room smelled of old coffee and the specific air-conditioned staleness of spaces where people worked through the night regularly. Slade pointed her to a chair in front of the center screen. We're going to start with Route 9, he said. 3 weeks ago. 14 November, 15:42 hours. The footage was traffic camera, which meant it was the flat, high-angle, slightly washed-out quality of municipal infrastructure, 2 lanes each direction. The Route 9 corridor heading east, the late afternoon light making everything slightly overexposed. Nora watched the timestamp move. At 15:42:07, a silver sedan came into frame from the left side entrance of a strip mall parking lot. It entered Route 9 without stopping, accelerating hard, which was the moment Nora's body remembered what she'd seen that evening before she'd fully registered it consciously. 3 vehicles had to brake hard. The silver sedan continued accelerating and clipped the rear quarter of an SUV in the right lane, which sent the SUV rotating 90 degrees into the left lane, where a pickup truck struck it broadside. The pickup went onto its side. The silver sedan kept going for 40 feet before braking. "That's Reed Callahan's vehicle," Slade said. "The silver sedan." "I know." She'd suspected, seeing it confirm the geometry she'd been carrying in her memory. "Watch." At 15:43:22, 1 minute 15 seconds after the collision, a patrol car came into frame from the east end of the frame, heading west. It passed the accident scene and continued without stopping. Nora looked at the plate on the patrol car. She looked at Slade. "That's Voss," he said. "He was already there." "He was already there." Slade clicked to the next clip. "Now here's what we didn't know until this afternoon, when we pulled 18 months of internal communications from City Hall through the federal subpoena Callaway issued." He let that number sit, 18 months, and she understood it meant this was not something that had started with Reed Callahan's accident. Dale Voss has been on Stuart Callahan's payroll through a series of consulting payments routed through a subsidiary of Callahan Civil Contractors. The payments started 22 months ago. Small amounts, irregular intervals, the way you'd structure something you didn't want to look like what it was. What was he providing in exchange? Accident report adjustments primarily. Callahan's construction vehicles operate heavy equipment on municipal roads. When there are incidents, worker injuries, minor collisions, a property damage claim, Voss was the reporting officer. 6 times in 22 months, the reports were adjusted after the fact to reduce Callahan's liability exposure. Slade set down the folder he'd been holding. "We think Route 9 was supposed to be the 7th. Reed Callahan causes an accident," Voss responds. "Report gets cleaned up. Straightforward." "Except I stopped." "Except you stopped. And you were there before Voss arrived, which meant there was already a witness who had assessed the scene and treated the most critical victim. Reed Callahan had cocaine in his system, which the blood draw at the hospital confirmed. The toxicology report was one of the things Voss attempted to flag for removal from the official file." Nora sat with that for a moment. Not with surprise, she'd been building toward this, but with the particular weight of understanding something fully that you'd only partially understood before. A 19-year-old in a pickup truck had gone onto his side on Route 9, and she'd been the first one to reach him, and she'd spent 40 minutes on the asphalt keeping him breathing, and the reason her shoulder was fractured and her job was suspended was because someone had decided that her presence at that scene was a liability that needed to be managed. "The complaint," she said, "the one routed through Gerald Park's office, was fabricated. There was no altercation. Voss needed a mechanism to discredit you preemptively, before you could speak to anyone officially about what you'd seen at the scene." Slade pulled up a document on the secondary screen. The complaint was drafted on Park's letterhead, which means Park was either directly involved or his office was accessed without his knowledge. "We're still determining which." "And today's accident," she looked at the screen, "the transport rerouting." Slade was quiet for a moment in a way that told her this was the part he was less comfortable with. Stuart Callahan's logistics company holds a subcontract with the city for coordination of non-civilian vehicle movements through the urban corridor. A minor contract, standard infrastructure arrangement. Nobody scrutinized it because the dollar value was low and the function seemed administrative. He paused. The military transport was carrying a consignment of communications equipment from Hargrove Base to the National Guard Depot on Route 15. The transfer documentation listed the transport as carrying non-sensitive cargo under standard protocols. Was it non-sensitive? The communications equipment itself was surplus, legitimately decommissioned, but the routing authorization, the code that allowed the city logistics office to redirect the transport through the urban corridor, was used by Callahan's subcontract office to generate a false emergency logistics adjustment. Someone in that office entered the code and redirected the transport to Route 9 so it would pass through the Harmer Bridge intersection at a specific time. She already knew what came next, but she let him say it. Roy Packer, the tanker driver, received a modified load sheet this morning telling him his scheduled Route 7 North run had been changed to Route 9 due to bridge maintenance closures. The modification was issued through the City Transport Coordination Office. There are no bridge maintenance closures on Route 7 today. Slade looked at her. He wasn't a co-conspirator. He was a driver following a dispatch order. And Hartley was placed at the intersection to... She stopped. To do what, exactly? Slade looked at his hands briefly. We believe his role was to control the initial scene response, establish the official narrative before federal units arrived. Voss was at the hospital handling you. Hartley was supposed to handle the scene. He paused. What they did not anticipate was a veterans convoy being half a mile away with a former Army combat nurse who was already running triage before any official unit arrived. Marcus, who had not spoken since they'd entered the room, said from behind her, "What were they trying to destroy in the transport?" Slade looked at him. The equipment itself wasn't the target, the transport was. He chose his next words carefully. There's a federal contractor review currently underway for the Route 9 expansion project. The review is examining whether Callahan civil contractors used improper influence in the bidding process, specifically whether communication equipment contracts connected to the expansion were routed through improper channels involving city logistics offices. He let that land. The review officer was scheduled to inspect the transport depot at Hargrove Base tomorrow morning. The room was quiet. They needed the depot inaccessible, Nora said. They needed the inspection delayed. A military transport incident involving federal investigation, road authorization questions, paperwork anomalies. It would have pushed the review timeline by weeks, long enough for certain documents to be relocated. Slade's voice was flat in the specific way of a person delivering information they found personally objectionable. Long enough for Stuart Callahan to conclude a secondary contract renewal that is currently pending City Council approval. Gerald Park's vote, Nora said. Park is one of 3 council members who can approve the renewal. Slade looked at her. The other 2, we discovered this evening, have received campaign funding from a PAC that traces back to a consulting company that lists its address as the same building as Callahan Civil Contractors. She sat back in the chair. Her shoulder registered the shift in position. She was past managing it now. The pain had achieved a kind of sustained altitude where it was simply part of the information she was operating with, like the fluorescent hum overhead or the cold that had gotten into her jacket on the walk from the parking lot. She looked at the screen, the frozen traffic camera image, Route 9 in the afternoon light, and a silver sedan still in frame, 40 feet past the accident it had caused, and in her memory the truck on its side and the boy inside it who was alive right now because she'd stopped. "What do you need from me?" she said. Slade looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected a longer emotional response and was recalibrating. "Your testimony. On record, tonight. About the original accident, what you observed, what you treated, in what sequence." He paused. "And we need you to authorize the release of your own medical records confirming the shoulder injury, the date, the mechanism. It establishes the timeline and corroborates the scene. You can have all of it. There's one more thing." He pulled a single sheet from the folder. "We're executing search warrants tonight. Callahan Civil Contractors offices, Voss's residence, Park City Hall office. We'd like this done before morning, before anyone not currently in custody has the chance to move anything." He looked at her. "You may want to be somewhere safe tonight. If Stuart Callahan is aware that his people are in custody and the federal warrants are in motion, there's a version of this where someone decides the problem is still you." Nora considered that. She thought about it the way she thought about all threat assessments, categorically, without the theater of fear. Stuart Callahan was a contractor with political reach and a dirty cop in a crooked logistics network. He was not a man who had ever had to deal with an outcome he couldn't route around. He was going to be dealing with one now, and men in that position made decisions that were sometimes stupid and sometimes dangerous. "I'll be fine," she said. "Nora," Marcus's voice. Quiet, even. The tone he used when he was not going to say something twice. She looked at him. "Let us handle that part," he said. She didn't argue. She was tired enough to accept help, which was its own kind of progress. The testimony took 2 hours. She gave it to a federal recorder and 2 agents in a side room off the main operations floor, starting from the moment she'd stopped her car on Route 9 and working forward through every clinical detail she remembered: the boy's breathing pattern, the intervention sequence, the timeline markers she'd clocked by force of habit. She was precise and she was exhaustive, and she did not editorialize. She let the facts carry the weight because facts, in her experience, were more durable than feelings. When she finished, the agent across from her, a woman named Park, no relation to the councilman, which she established early and briskly, looked at her recorder, then at Nora. "Captain Callahan," she said. "Not Ms. Captain. I want to confirm, you received no compensation, no notification of any kind from any party before you stopped at the Route 9 accident." "I stopped because there was an accident." Park nodded. She made a note. Nora walked out of the side room at 8:40 p.m. and found Marcus in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee he'd gotten from somewhere, holding both of them with the patience of a man who was very good at waiting. She took one. It was terrible coffee. She drank it anyway. "Hartley talked," Marcus said. She looked at him. "Calloway told me while you were in there." Hartley gave them names. 3 officers total. Voss, Hartley, and a third in the traffic division whose name I don't have. All 3 connected to Callahan through the same payment structure. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "And Park, the councilman. Hartley says Park wasn't aware of the transport rerouting, says he thought the only thing he'd signed off on was the complaint against you. He thought signing a fabricated complaint was acceptable. He apparently thought it was a gray area. There's no gray area." "No," Marcus agreed. "There isn't." She drank the rest of the coffee. "What about Stuart Callahan himself?" "Calloway's team went to his office at 8 o'clock. He wasn't there." Marcus's voice was neutral. "He was at City Hall in a closed meeting with 2 members of the Contract Review Board. The meeting had been scheduled this afternoon, after the accident." She understood what that meant. Callahan had known, or suspected, that things were moving, and he'd gone to do the one thing that might still save the contract: apply direct pressure to the people who controlled the review. He wasn't running. He was doubling down, which was either confidence or desperation, and at this point the two were indistinguishable. "Calloway went to City Hall," Marcus said. It was a statement. "Good. There are going to be cameras there." "Even better." She set down her empty cup and straightened. Her shoulder had moved past the grinding sensation and into something duller and more pervasive. And she knew from experience that duller meant the inflammation was settling rather than building, which was marginally preferable. She was not going to be able to do anything useful with that arm for at least a week. She found Slade at the main workstation. "I want to be there," she said. "At City Hall." He looked up. "That's not standard." "I'm not asking as a participant. I'm asking as a witness." She met his gaze. "Stuart Callahan has spent 3 weeks trying to make me invisible. I want to be in the room when that stops working." Slade was quiet for a moment. He had the face of a man weighing institutional protocol against something harder to quantify. "You'd stay back. You wouldn't speak." "Well, I know how to be in a room without speaking." He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair. City Hall in Driftwood Falls was a 3-story building on Coleman Square, with the kind of limestone facade that municipal governments favored when they wanted to project permanence. At 9:15 p.m., it should have been empty except for security. The lights in the 3rd-floor conference room said otherwise. They arrived in 2 vehicles, Calloway's federal SUV and a second car with Slade and 2 additional agents. Nora rode with Slade. Marcus had offered to wait, but she'd told him no, which he'd accepted without discussion, and she understood that his going back to the parking lot at Kessler, where the convoy was still waiting, was not acquiescence, it was logistics. The building's night security let them through when Calloway showed his credentials, and they took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and the door to the main conference room was closed, but the voices inside were audible, even through it. 2 voices in the particular cadence of people negotiating something they'd both rather not be negotiating. Calloway knocked. The voices stopped. A beat, and then the door opened. A man in his 50s in a good suit who was not Stuart Callahan looked at the badges and went a color that made Nora think about blood pressure readings. "This is a private meeting," he said. "I know," Calloway said. "I need to speak with Mr. Callahan." Stuart Callahan was standing at the far end of the conference table. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, with the particular physical self-possession of a man who had spent decades being the biggest financial presence in most rooms he entered. He was wearing a gray jacket, no tie, and he was holding a document that he set down on the table with deliberate calm when he saw the badges. "Agent Calloway," he said it with the ease of a man using a name he'd already looked up. "I assume this is about the accident this afternoon." "It's about several things," Calloway said. Callahan looked at Nora. She was standing in the doorway behind Calloway, which put her at the edge of the room, exactly where she'd said she'd stay. She looked back at him without expression. Something shifted in his face. Not recognition, he'd never met her, but something that was the specific reaction of a man encountering a variable he'd considered eliminated. "Who is that?" he said. "Nora Callahan," Calloway said. "No relation. ER nurse, Kessler Regional Medical Center. She was the first responder at the Route 9 accident on November 14th. He paused. "And at the Harmer Bridge collision today." Callahan looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then he looked at his attorney, who had materialized from somewhere in the room and was already reaching for his phone. "I'm going to need a moment with my client," the attorney said. "Of course," Calloway said. "We'll be in the hall." They stepped out. The door closed. Through it, Nora could hear nothing, which meant the room was better insulated than it looked, or the conversation was being held in something below normal speaking volume, which told her something about both men's training in this specific kind of moment. She stood in the hallway under the fluorescent lights and looked at the closed door and felt the evening's full weight settle on her shoulders. Both of them, the good one and the fractured one, with equal indifference. "You holding up?" Calloway said from beside her. "Yes." "Your shoulder needs imaging." "I know." "You've known for a while." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have been home 3 hours ago." "I should have been a lot of places," she said. "Didn't work out that way." He almost smiled. It looked like the cousin of a smile, something related but more tired. The warrants executed at Callahan's offices an hour ago. They found what they were looking for in the logistics division: the route modification order, the false bridge maintenance report, the communication records with Hartley and Voss dating back 4 months on the transport rerouting specifically. He paused. "And they found a file on you." She turned to look at him. "Background research. Your address, your schedule at Kessler, your vehicle registration, your military record, which required some effort to obtain given how that information is protected." His voice was flat, but the flatness was doing work. "They had your discharge rank, your deployment record, your commendations." He paused again. Someone wanted to know who they were dealing with. She looked back at the closed door. "They knew I was Army. They knew before they sent Voss to the hospital this morning. They decided to proceed anyway." She turned that over. They'd known, and they'd proceeded anyway. Either because they'd thought it didn't matter, that the suspension and the citation would be enough, that she'd be too occupied defending herself to look outward, or because by that point they were too far in to stop. Either answer said something about Stuart Callahan that she filed under character assessment and left there. The door opened. The attorney came out first. He was a man who'd learned how to make his face communicate nothing, and he was doing that now, but the set of his shoulders said something different. "My client will speak with you," he said, "under the following conditions." "No conditions," Calloway said. He wasn't unkind about it. "He can have counsel present, and he can decline to answer any specific question. That's what the law provides. I don't negotiate beyond that tonight." The attorney looked at him. He looked at the door. He went back in. Calloway followed, Slade followed, the 2 additional agents followed. Nora stayed in the doorway. Stuart Callahan was sitting at the conference table now. The document he'd been holding was no longer visible. He looked like a man who had decided that the move was composure, and he was executing it well enough that someone who didn't know what she knew might have been convinced. Calloway sat across from him and opened a folder. Mr. Callahan, he said, I want to talk about the logistics subcontract your company holds with the city of Driftwood Falls, and specifically about an administrative access code that was used this afternoon to redirect a military transport through the Harmer Bridge intersection. Callahan looked at his attorney. His attorney gave a minimal nod. I'm not aware of any irregular use of that contract, Callahan said. Calloway turned a page. Roy Packer, your tanker driver on the Route 9 Harmer Bridge run today, received a modified dispatch order at 11:14 this morning. The modification was generated from an IP address registered to a workstation in your logistics division office. He set a printed document on the table and turned it to face Callahan. This is the modification record. Callahan looked at it. His face did nothing. An employee could have... The access code used to generate the modification is a supervisory level code, Calloway said. There are 3 people in your logistics division with that access level. We have communication records from 2 of them placing them out of the office until noon today. He turned another page. The 3rd is you. Silence. Not the performative silence of someone choosing their words, the heavier kind. Nora watched Callahan's hands on the table. They were still. Perfectly, deliberately still. She knew what it cost to hold that kind of stillness, and it told her something about the discipline the man had built his career on and how little it was going to matter in the next 20 minutes. I'd like to consult with my attorney, Callahan said. Of course, Calloway said. He stood. He gathered his folder. We'll need you to remain in the building. He came back to the door. He looked at Nora briefly. Not a report, not a summary, just a look that acknowledged she'd been there for it and that it had gone the way it had gone. She stepped back from the doorway. In the conference room, Callahan and his attorney had moved close together. Their voices dropped below anything she could hear. Through the window beside the conference room door, she could see the lights of Coleman Square below. The small park, the fountain that was turned off for winter, 2 parked police cars that were not associated with this building and were simply there because they were always there. Her phone buzzed. Dante, she answered. Nora. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Fitch resigned. She blinked. When? 20 minutes ago. He sent an email to the board, effective immediately. No explanation. A pause. The board chair called me because I'm the senior staff member who's been here longest, and they wanted to know what happened today. Another pause. I didn't know where to start. Start from the beginning, she said. Tell them everything. That's what I figured. She could hear him exhale. The suspension, Nora. The board is going to want to address it. I know. Tonight, probably. They're already talking about it. She looked at the conference room door. Through the small window, she could see Stuart Callahan's gray jacket, the back of his head, the document his attorney was showing him that she couldn't read from here. She thought about Gerald Fitch sending an email to a board at 9 o'clock at night. She thought about what that email had cost him in pride and what its absence would have cost him in exposure. She thought about the calculation men like Fitch made when the structural support that held their decisions upright started to give. Dante, she said, tell the board I'll call them tomorrow. They want to... Tomorrow, she said. I'm in the middle of something. She ended the call. Calloway had gone back down the hallway to speak with Slade, and the 2 additional agents were at the far end near the elevator, and Nora was alone in the 3rd-floor corridor of Driftwood Falls City Hall at 9:40 p.m., with a fractured shoulder and 3 weeks of accumulated injustice, and the particular exhaustion that came not from doing too much, but from holding too much without being allowed to set it down. She leaned against the wall. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, the old habit, and she found the still point and she stayed there for 4 seconds. Then she opened her eyes. Calloway was coming back down the hall. His face had the look of a man who'd just received information that changed the shape of his evening. What? She said. Our tech team. He stopped in front of her. They went through Hartley's phone, the cracked screen one. He paused. There are communications there between Hartley and a third party that we hadn't identified yet. The third party's number traces to a prepaid phone, unregistered, but the content of the communications... He stopped again in a way that told her he was choosing how to say this. Tell me, she said. The messages describe a surveillance schedule, Calloway said. Your movements? Kessler Regional, your residential address, your route to and from work, starting 6 days ago. He kept his eyes on her face, watching something. And there's a message from last night, 9:47 p.m., from the unregistered number. It says, if she becomes a problem after the event, handle it like the last one. The hallway was very quiet. She heard what he meant, and she sat with it. Handle it like the last one, which meant there had been a last one, which meant she was not the first person who had complicated a Callahan cleanup operation. Who was the last one? She said. Calloway's jaw was tight. We're trying to determine that. The phrase suggests a previous incident, a previous witness or obstacle. He paused. There may be a victim we don't know about yet. She thought about Roy Packer in the cab of the tanker, following a dispatch order he'd been given that morning, not knowing it was designed to put him into the path of a military transport. She thought about the corporal who drove where his orders said, and had ended up with a cut above his ear and a shredded truck on Route 9. She thought about the 19-year-old in the pickup truck who'd lived because she'd stopped, and whether there were other people who'd needed someone to stop, and whether anyone had. You need to find out, she said. That's more important than anything tonight. I know. His voice was quiet and specific. I need you to know that you're a protected witness as of right now. This office will... That's not what I meant. He looked at her. If there's someone else, she said, they might still be waiting for someone to stop. He was still for a moment. Something in his expression, not softness exactly, but a recognition of something. We'll find them, he said. I'll make sure of it. She nodded once. At the far end of the hall, the elevator doors opened. Calloway looked past her. His face changed. She turned. 2 uniformed Driftwood Falls police officers stepped off the elevator. Behind them, in a suit he clearly hadn't expected to be wearing at this hour, was a man she hadn't seen before, 50s, silver-haired, wearing the expression of a person who had been somewhere comfortable 20 minutes ago and was now here, in a building he hadn't intended to visit tonight. Calloway said quietly, That's Deputy Chief Harlan Morse. She didn't know the name, but Calloway's tone told her the name was significant, and the way the deputy chief's eyes moved across the hallway, taking in Calloway's credentials, slayed at the far end, the closed conference room door, told her this was not a social call. Morse walked directly to Calloway. He didn't look at Nora. Agent Calloway, he said, I need to know what's happening in that room. Federal investigation, Deputy Chief. I can brief you on what I'm authorized to share. One of my officers is in your custody. 2, Calloway said, and a third we'll be speaking with before morning. Morse's jaw worked. On whose authority? Federal material witness warrants with additional charges pending. Calloway kept his voice even. Deputy Chief, I'm going to need to know your relationship to Stuart Callahan. The hallway was very quiet again. Morse looked at Calloway for a long time. Then he looked past Calloway, and his gaze landed on Nora, really landed, the way Callahan's had in the conference room. The look of a man encountering something he'd believed had been managed, and Nora saw it. In his eyes, in the half-second before he controlled his expression. He knew who she was. Not her name, maybe, but her function. The person who had stopped at Route 9. The variable that had made everything complicated. He knew exactly who she was. And she understood in that moment that the phone with the unregistered number, the one that had sent messages about her movements, about handling the last one, might not have belonged to someone she hadn't met yet. Calloway had the same thought at the same moment. She could tell by the way his body shifted, minimal, controlled, but present. Deputy Chief Morse, he said, I'm going to need you to come with me. Morse looked at the conference room door. He looked at the 2 officers he'd brought with him, who were now slightly less sure about where they were standing. He looked at Calloway. He said nothing. And his silence in that third-floor hallway at 9:47 p.m. was the loudest thing that had been said all night. Morse's silence lasted 4 seconds. Then he said, I want my attorney. And those 3 words confirmed everything. Calloway didn't react visibly. He turned to the 2 uniformed officers Morse had brought with him, young men, both of them, who were now standing in the particular posture of people who'd arrived somewhere expecting one situation and found a completely different one. And he said quietly, I need you both to wait downstairs with Agent Reiser. Don't make any calls until I've spoken with your division commander. He said it without drama, and they went without argument, because the specific authority in his voice left no reasonable alternative. Morse was escorted to a separate room down the hall. Not arrested. Not yet. But separated from the conference room where Stuart Callahan sat with his attorney, separated from whatever conversation those two men might have had if they'd been allowed proximity for another 5 minutes. Nora watched Morse walk down the hallway between two federal agents, and she thought about the unregistered phone, the message about her movements. Handle it like the last one. She thought about what it meant that a deputy chief of police had appeared at City Hall 20 minutes after federal warrants hit Callahan's offices. Not because he'd been summoned, but because he'd come on his own, because he'd known something was happening and had decided that physical presence was the move. It was the move of a man who believed he could still manage the situation. She found Calloway in the hallway outside the second room. The previous victim, she said. Handle it like the last one. Do you have anything yet? He looked at his phone. He'd been checking it. My team is cross-referencing incidents, accidents involving Callahan construction vehicles over the past 3 years, where witnesses later withdrew statements or became unreachable. He paused. We have 3 candidates. 2 of them moved out of state within 6 months of their incidents. The third, he stopped. Tell me. A man named Barry Okafor, 44 years old. He was a transportation inspector who flagged an irregularity in a Callahan subcontract 18 months ago. 3 weeks after he filed the report, he was in a single vehicle accident on Route 12. No other vehicles involved. He survived but sustained a traumatic brain injury and was on medical leave for 7 months. Calloway looked at her directly. The accident investigation was handled by Officer Voss. The hallway was quiet. Okafor's report was withdrawn while he was on medical leave, Calloway continued. The withdrawal was filed by a representative from his department. We're looking at whether the representative was acting with his knowledge. She knew, without being told, that the representative had not been acting with Okafor's knowledge. She knew it the same way she'd known, standing at the Harmer Bridge intersection, looking at the sight lines, that Roy Packer hadn't chosen that route himself. Some things had a shape that told you what they were before the evidence caught up. He needs to know, she said. Okafor. Whatever happens next, he needs to know what happened to him wasn't an accident. He'll know, Calloway said. I'll make sure of it personally. She believed him. Not because she was inclined to trust federal agents categorically, she wasn't, but because of the specific way he'd said personally, which was the word people used when they were attaching their own name to a promise rather than their institutions. It was after midnight when the formal arrest warrants were signed. Stuart Callahan was taken from the City Hall conference room at 12:14 a.m. He walked out between 2 federal agents in the gray jacket he'd been wearing all evening, and he walked with the posture of a man who had not yet accepted that the ground under him was gone. Chin level, pace controlled, no visible reaction. It was an impressive performance. It was also, Nora understood, the only thing he had left to perform. His attorney was already on his phone before they reached the elevator. Harlan Morse was arrested 20 minutes later, in the separate room where he'd been waiting with Calloway's agents. He was charged initially with obstruction of justice and abuse of official authority, with additional charges pending the investigation into Barry Okafor's accident. He did not maintain his composure the way Callahan had. He argued, briefly and pointlessly, and then he stopped arguing and said nothing at all, which was the right decision 3 hours too late. Dale Voss, who had been in federal custody since the hospital corridor, was formally charged in the early hours, falsifying official reports, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and accessory to assault, the last charge connecting him to the operation against Okafor. Officer Hartley was charged with obstruction and conspiracy. The 3rd Traffic Division officer, whose name was Gary Sen, 29 years old, 18 months on the force, who had apparently understood only part of what he'd gotten himself into, cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges, and his cooperation produced the clearest picture yet of how Voss had run the operation. Selectively, compartmentally, each person knowing only enough to do their piece. Gerald Park, the councilman, was not arrested that night. His situation was more complicated. A man who had signed a document without apparently understanding its full purpose, which was either genuine ignorance or a very specific kind of willful ignorance that the attorneys would spend months arguing over. He resigned from the city council at 7 a.m. the following morning in a statement that was careful and contrite and conspicuously avoided admitting to anything specific. Nora wasn't awake for any of the arrests. Marcus had driven her to County General at 11:30 because Calloway had told her for the third time that her shoulder needed imaging, and this time something in the way her arm had stopped cooperating with basic tasks made the argument for her. The X-ray confirmed what she'd suspected. The original fracture had a new stress line running perpendicular to the first, which the radiologist described as consistent with repetitive strain on an incompletely healed injury, and which Nora translated privately as the price of 40 minutes on the Route 9 asphalt, and triage in the back of a military transport, and running toward a burning vehicle, and all the other things she'd done that day that she would do again without changing a single one. She sat in the County General Radiology waiting room at 12:40 a.m., with her arm in a temporary sling and a prescription for actual pain medication she hadn't filled yet, and Marcus sat beside her with his long legs stretched out in front of him, and they were both quiet in the comfortable way of people who had long ago learned that silence between them wasn't empty. "How bad?" he said. 6 weeks, minimum, possibly 8. She looked at the ceiling. "I'll be slower in the ER." "You'll adapt." "I know." She paused. "I always do." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what I kept thinking about today? At the crash site, when you were in the back of that transport working on the soldier?" She waited. "I kept thinking you looked exactly the same as you did in Kandahar, running the casualty collection point after the vehicle strike." He looked at his hands. "Same face, same economy of movement, like the volume of everything else just turns down." He paused. "I don't know if that's a good thing or not." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things that deserved a real answer. "I don't know either," she said, "but it's what I have, so I use it." He nodded. That was enough. At 1:15 a.m., her phone buzzed with a number she recognized now, Slade's direct line. "Deputy Chief Morse confirmed the message," Slade said without preamble. "He sent it. The surveillance schedule on you, the instruction about handling the situation, his words, his phone. He's entering a full cooperation agreement as of an hour ago." A pause. "His attorney negotiated it fast, which tells you what the attorney thinks the evidence looks like." "And Okafor?" she said. "We spoke with him tonight. He's in Millfield, 200 miles north, been living there since the accident, working a desk job with the County Roads Department. Slade stopped briefly. "He cried when we told him, said he thought for 18 months that he'd just been unlucky." She closed her eyes for 1 second. "Tell him he wasn't unlucky. Tell him he was targeted by people who were afraid of what he knew, which means what he knew mattered." "I'll tell him." "And tell him his report is going to be reinstated, that what he found is part of this now, that it counts." A pause. "I'll pass that along." Another pause. "Ms. Callahan, what you did today, stopping at both scenes, running triage under the conditions you were under, following the thread when most people would have gone home." He stopped. She got the sense he'd started the sentence with a different ending in mind and then changed it. "It mattered. I want you to know that." She didn't deflect it. She'd learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that deflecting things that were true wasn't modesty. It was just a different kind of evasion. "Thank you," she said. "Make sure Okafor knows his matters too." She ended the call. Marcus was looking at her. She told him about Okafor in 2 sentences. His jaw tightened and then released, which was how he showed things he didn't have words for. "Let's go," she said. "I need 4 hours of sleep." He stood. He held out his hand, not to help her up, just offered it, an old gesture from a different time, the way you offered a hand to someone after something hard. She took it and stood, and they walked out of County General into the November night, and the cold was still there, the same cold it had been all day, and it hit her face, and she let it. The board of Kessler Regional Medical Center held an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. the following morning, which was Thursday, which was the day after the longest Wednesday Nora Callahan could remember. She attended via phone because her car was still in the hospital parking lot, and Marcus had driven her there and was sitting in the lobby reading something on his phone while she stood outside in the staff lot with her arm in its sling and the prescription medication finally doing something useful and the weak November sun making a half-hearted appearance over the roof tine of the building she'd been suspended from 16 hours ago. The board chair, a woman named Aldous Brennan, who had the precise diction of someone who'd spent 40 years in hospital administration and had stopped being surprised by most things, spoke for 4 minutes. The suspension was rescinded immediately and with formal apology. The complaint filed through Gerald Park's office was struck from Nora's personnel record entirely. The board expressed its regret for acting on unverified information under institutional pressure, which was the diplomatic phrasing for Gerald Fitch moved fast without asking the right questions, which was itself the diplomatic phrasing for something less flattering. Brennan asked if Nora had questions. She had one. Who approved the suspension? A pause. Mr. Fitch acted under his administrative authority. With board knowledge? Another pause. Longer. The board was not consulted in advance, which meant Fitch had moved unilaterally, and the board was now managing the consequences of that, which meant Fitch had been confident enough in the backing he believed he had. Voss, Callahan, the infrastructure of protection that had held for 22 months, that he hadn't felt the need to cover himself with the board. That confidence had evaporated overnight, and Fitch, who was no longer employed by Kessler Regional Medical Center, was now someone else's problem. No other questions, Nora said. Brennan paused again. When she spoke next, something in her voice had shifted, not warmer exactly, but more present, less administrative. Ms. Callahan, Captain Callahan, the board is aware of your military background and of what you did yesterday, both at the accident scene and in the course of the investigation. We're aware that you continued to act on behalf of patients and victims while under an unjust suspension, while injured, under circumstances that were... She stopped. We want you back. We want you to know that. Nora looked at the roof of the hospital, the brickwork, the ventilation units on top of it, necessary and unglamorous. She thought about the ER inside, the whiteboard she checked every morning, Dante and his bad timing and his good instincts, the 8 years of practice that had made her what she was. I'll be back Monday, she said. Desk duties until the shoulder clears for full activity. We can... Monday, she said. I'll need the weekend. She ended the call. She turned around and leaned against her car, which was still exactly where she'd parked it yesterday morning when none of this had happened yet. She looked at the ambulance bay where Voss had put her face first against a hood. The concrete was unremarkable. It was just a surface. The thing that had happened on it was already somewhere else, in federal case files, in her own memory, in the shoulder that was going to remind her of it for the next 8 weeks. The ambulance bay doors opened. Dante came out, saw her, and stopped. He was holding 2 coffees, which meant he'd known she was here, or strongly suspected it, because 2 coffees in the ambulance bay at 8:15 was not a coincidence. He crossed the lot. He handed her a cup. Good coffee or bad coffee? She said. Bad coffee. The machine's been broken since Tuesday. I know. She took it. Thank you. He stood beside her and looked at the parking lot for a moment. You look terrible. I've been told. The shoulder? Stress fracture on top of the original, 6 to 8 weeks. He winced. The board called me after they called you. Brennan wanted my assessment of the situation. What did you tell her? I told her the situation was that one of their nurses had been falsely suspended while actively running triage at a federal accident scene, and that if the board had any follow-up questions, they could read the federal investigation summary. He paused. She seemed to feel that covered it. Nora almost laughed. It came out as something slightly less than a laugh, but in the same neighborhood. You're going to make someone a very inconvenient ally someday, Dante. I already am. He drank his coffee. Barry Okafor called the hospital this morning. He's not a patient here, never has been, but he called the main line and asked to leave a message for you. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. The receptionist wrote it down. She took the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was the receptionist's, neat and rounded. Tell her I didn't understand until last night what happened to me. Tell her I'm going to reopen my report. Tell her thank you for not looking away. She folded the paper back. She put it in her own jacket pocket. The thing she felt was complicated in the way that things felt when they mattered more than you were prepared for. She hadn't met Barry Okafor. She'd learned his name 16 hours ago in a federal operations room. But she understood, with the particular understanding that came from being a person who had stopped when stopping was inconvenient, that what had happened to him was the thing that had almost happened to her, the quiet erasure of someone who'd seen something and wouldn't let it go. The difference between their outcomes was not virtue or effort or righteousness. It was the difference between being alone when the machinery came for you and having someone stop. She'd had people stop. Marcus and 46 others pulling into a parking lot on motorcycles because she'd made a phone call. Dante, who'd asked around when she'd asked him to and hadn't asked her why. Torres, who'd come back to the hospital to tell her a soldier was going to be okay. Calloway, who'd said personally and meant it. The people who stopped were the whole story. Everything else was just what happened when enough of them showed up. The story broke publicly on Friday morning. Not all at once. It never happened all at once, despite what the headlines implied. It leaked through the seams first. A federal transportation investigation, arrests pending in connection with a municipal corruption network, an active duty accident that had been traced to deliberate route manipulation. By Friday afternoon, the local news had the shape of it, and by Friday evening, 2 national outlets had picked up the federal charges and the names attached to them: Stuart Callahan, Harlan Morse, Dale Voss, Gerald Park. The network of payments and favors and adjusted reports that had held together for almost 2 years before a nurse stopped at an accident on Route 9 and didn't stop being a problem. The coverage found Nora's name almost immediately, the way coverage found names when there was a human thread to pull. Former Army combat nurse, suspended the morning of the accident, running triage at the federal crash scene while under that suspension. The details were accurate. The framing was the kind that made good television, which was not the same thing as making her comfortable. She didn't give interviews. She got a call from a producer at a national news program, which she declined. She got a call from a journalist she'd heard of but didn't know, which she also declined. She got 14 texts from people she'd worked with at various points in her life who'd seen her name and wanted to reach out, and she answered 8 of them briefly and let the other 6 sit until she had more energy. Marcus called on Saturday morning. "You've seen the coverage. Some of it. How are you doing with it?" "I'm doing fine with it." She paused. "It's strange to be visible." "You were always visible to people who were paying attention. That's different." "Yeah," he said. "It is." A pause. "The soldier. The TBI case at County General. Petra's been checking in. She came off sedation yesterday morning. She's talking." Nora let that land. "What's her name?" "Sergeant Adrienne Villanueva, 28. She was on her 3rd deployment before she rotated out. She's been stateside for 6 months. Will she be okay?" "The neurosurgeon said she'll have a full recovery. Might take time, but full." He paused. She asked about the nurse who ran triage at the scene. Nora said nothing. "Petra told her," Marcus said. "Told her who you were, what you'd done before and what you did yesterday." A pause. "She said to tell you she's glad you were there." The Saturday morning light was coming through Nora's kitchen window at a flat, low angle. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of actual decent coffee she'd made herself in the apartment she'd lived in for 2 years, in the city where she'd come to find out who she was when no one was shooting at her. She'd been working on that project. She was still working on it. She thought about what it meant that yesterday, the worst professional day she'd had in 2 years, the day she'd been cuffed and suspended and implicated in a conspiracy she'd stumbled into by stopping to help, had also been a day when she'd known exactly what to do in every critical moment. Not because she was exceptional, because she was trained and experienced and had once spent 5 years becoming someone who could be useful in the worst situations. That training hadn't been wasted. The discharge hadn't been an ending. The quiet civilian life in Driftwood Falls hadn't been hiding. It had been living, imperfect and inconclusive and ongoing, the way living actually was. And when something had needed her to be more than quiet, she had been. Without drama, without announcement. That was the thing she understood about herself now, standing on the other side of it. She didn't become someone different under pressure. She became more fully what she already was. "Marcus," she said. "Yeah." Tell Sergeant Villanueva I'm glad I was there, too. On Monday morning, Nora Callahan returned to Kessler Regional Medical Center. She parked in the same spot she always used, because parking habits were one of the small structures she'd built her routine around, and there was no reason to change them. She walked through the ambulance bay doors at 5:48 a.m., 12 minutes before her shift technically began. The ER was the ER. Monitors, linoleum, the smell of antiseptic, and the early shift energy that was always slightly wired and slightly exhausted simultaneously. The whiteboard had 4 patients already listed from the overnight. Margaret Ewan was at the charge desk. She looked up when Nora came through. She didn't say anything. She just looked at Nora for a moment, a thorough, specific look, the kind that was taking inventory, and then she turned back to the board and said, "Bay 2 needs a reassessment. The overnight notes are incomplete." "I'll get it," Nora said. She went to Bay 2. The patient was an elderly man named Harold Vesper, 73, who'd come in overnight with chest pain that had resolved, but whose ECG showed something worth watching. He was awake, sitting up, wearing the particular expression of someone who'd been in the hospital long enough to be bored, but not long enough to be comfortable. "Good morning," Nora said. "I'm Nora. I'm your nurse." He looked at her arm in the sling. "What happened to you?" "Long story. How are you feeling?" "Better than I did," which isn't saying much. He studied her. "You look like you haven't slept." "I got 4 hours." "That's not sleep. That's a nap." He shifted in the bed. "My wife says I should be more sympathetic to medical staff. She's right. She usually is. I'm Harold." "Harold." She picked up the tablet with his chart. "Let's talk about your heart." He relaxed back against the pillow with the small sound of someone who'd been waiting to talk to someone who knew what they were doing. "Finally," he said. She worked through the assessment. She noted the things that mattered and the things that needed watching and the one thing she wanted the attending physician to look at. She did it carefully and completely, with her good arm and her fractured one and her 4 hours of sleep and the weight of the last week sitting somewhere behind her sternum, where she'd put it until she had room to deal with it properly. When she was done, Harold Vesper looked at her the way that patients sometimes looked at nurses who'd been thorough, a look that had gratitude in it, but also something more basic, more human. The look of a person who'd been uncertain and was now less uncertain. "Thank you," he said. "Really, thank you." She looked at him and she thought briefly and without self-consciousness about all the patients she'd had who'd said that, on roadsides and in forward operating bases and in emergency rooms and on the pavement of Route 9 at 4 p.m. on a Thursday 3 weeks ago. All the people who'd been in the worst moment of their day and needed someone to stop. She had never once regretted stopping. That was the whole of it, really. Strip away the corruption and the arrests and the federal warrants and the cascade of consequences still moving through Driftwood Falls like a slow current rearranging stones. Strip all of it away, and what remained was the same thing it had always been: a person in trouble and someone who stopped. The system had tried to make stopping cost too much. It had suspended her and cuffed her and threatened her with citations and sent a surveillance schedule to a man who'd written "handle it" like the last one into a phone he thought couldn't be traced. It had done all of that, and it had not worked, because the cost of stopping was never actually the thing that determined whether she stopped. She stopped because she couldn't not stop, because the person who didn't stop wasn't a version of herself she recognized, because training and conscience and the particular stubbornness that had kept her breathing on a cot in Kandahar when quieter people would have given up were all the same quality wearing different clothes. The people who built systems to punish that quality always underestimated it. They thought they were dealing with compliance, that someone who appeared quiet and manageable was quiet and manageable all the way through. They'd never understood that some people were quiet on the surface because they didn't need to be loud. The work was the proof. The standing up was the proof. The refusal to become smaller to make powerful men comfortable. That was the whole proof. She left Bay 2 and went back to the charge desk and picked up the next chart, and the ER moved around her the way it always moved, continuous, slightly chaotic, fundamentally necessary, and she moved with it. At 7:30 a.m., Dante arrived for his shift and found her at the medication station. "You're smiling," he said, with the specific suspicion of someone who'd known her long enough to find this notable. I'm not smiling. The left side of your face is doing something. It's early. I haven't calibrated yet. She handed him a patient file. Bay 3 needs you. Possible appendicitis? The overnight doc wasn't sure. He took the file. He looked at her for one more second. It's good to have you back, Nora. She thought about Harold Vesper and his wife, who was usually right, and Sergeant Adrienne Villanueva coming off sedation and asking about the nurse, and Barry Okafor in Millfield rewriting a report that had been taken from him while he was lying in a hospital bed with a brain injury, and all of it, all of the weight and the cost and the damage and the survival, arranged itself into something she could carry. It's good to be back, she said, and she meant it without qualification, which was the most complete kind of meaning there was.